All right. Well, this is the Juneau Gastineau Rotary Club on January 14th, 2021. And we are pleased to welcome today as our speaker, Scott Kendall, who's was deeply involved in the efforts to get ballot measure 2 passed, which did pass for election reform in our last election. So we've invited Scott here today to tell us more about what's going to happen next with ballot measure 2 issues. So Scott, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, and you can share your screen if you'd like to.
Yeah, I'm gonna, because it has passed, I'm gonna spare you all the persuasive PowerPoint and just kind of talk about where we're at and what ballot measure 2 does. But I appreciate it. Thank you to everyone for giving me the time early in the morning. So I was the attorney and author of ballot measure 2, which came together in kind of early 2019 and did pass by 1% here in the general election. It is a 3-part reform, and apologies if this is a review for anyone, but just kind of want to set the background. It's got 3 components. Component 1 is campaign finance reform. Component 2 is open top 4 primaries, and component 3 is ranked choice voting on the general election. Dark money, which is a kind of a term of art, going through the 3 components. Dark money is essentially money that's spent in elections that's anonymous one way or the other. As everyone probably knows, since the Citizens United case in 2010, we've had unlimited spending in candidate elections in the United States. That's been true kind of from the federal races on down to state races. What ballot measure 2 did on dark money was in state-run elections, because those are the only ones we can affect in state law, it has required that if you spend money in election, essentially we will know the name of your donors. In the status quo, what happens is people tend, wealthy individuals tend to run their money through 1 or 2 or 3 intermediate entities, and those are the entities reported as donating, but that's in fact not where the money came from. I, in Alaska, can say, boy, I'd like $5 million to be spent in our next governor's race. If I had that kind of money, I might donate it to the Florida Chamber of Commerce, who might donate it to the State Leadership Fund, which in turn donates it to Alaskans for Working Families. And at the end of the day, that's all you see up here in Alaska. And so ballot measure 2 was an attempt, because we cannot limit the spending because of the Citizens United decision. But what we can do is say, you got to disclose. And so if you're going to spend money, we'll know your name. And that's that part of the initiative in a nutshell. The next part is a departure from what we've got now, which is currently we have semi-closed primaries. Some people could vote in some elections, some people can vote in others. The Democrat and everyone else a ballot, anyone can vote on. The Republicans have chosen to limit access to their ballot, but no Alaskan can take both ballots. So if you want to vote for an independent or a Democrat in one race and a Republican in another race in your primary election, you can't do it. So ballot measure 2 changes that. It says every candidate for any office will appear on one single ballot, and you'll choose your favorite, and the top 4 vote getters go on to the general, regardless of party. So that's that reform, which is really aimed at breaking the level of control that parties and party operatives have over public officials. Right now, probably 3/4 of our legislative races are non-competitive, meaning whoever wins the primary of a certain party wins. But we know primaries are incredibly low turnout. There are barriers to participation. And so you can see things like, maybe they saw in Fairbanks where longtime Senator John Coghill lost his primary. 5.1, 5.2 of his constituents voted against him. And yet the other 95% are kind of shut out because of that low turnout nature of that partisan primary. So this is an attempted remedy to that people who do the will of a majority of their constituents will get to make their case on the general election ballot. And then finally, kind of what people find the most interesting reform is ranked choice voting on the general election ballot. And what that means is when you see your ballot, it'll look much like it does now with a list of candidates on that x-axis. But on the y-axis, instead of one bubble, you'll have bubbles 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you can count to 4, you can do this. You just simply rank your candidates in order of your preference. And what this does is it prevents a spoiler effect because no one can win without a true majority. So if you go and you count up all those first place votes and no one has 50% plus one, then the candidate in last place is eliminated, and the people who voted for that candidate can have their votes assigned to their next preferred choice. That's optional. You can vote just like you vote now, vote for one and walk away, or you can decide to rank your vote. And we've seen examples of that in Alaska politics. I think most famously, Senator Murkowski's write-in campaign, where there really were three choices and three competitive choices, and voters had to vote strategically. A lot of voters thought, this is who I want to vote for, but this is who I don't want to win. And it just eliminates that spoiler effect where often people vote, but they get the opposite of what they voted for. Or you end up with 60% or more of the population that's unhappy with the choice, but there was no way to sort of truly show the will of the people. And we had people up until this current election with Senator Sullivan, we had not had a US senator win a majority of the vote since 2002. And so it just eliminates that spoiler effect, which makes our election subject to manipulation. Both parties have done it, which is if you're a Democrat, you will hope or entice an Alaska Independence Party or Libertarian candidate into a race in the hopes they take votes from the Republican. And if you're a Republican, you'll hope that a Green or an independent gets in the race and takes votes from the Democrat. Or if you're running as a strong independent, you'll hope that a Democrat gets in the race. And we've seen that again and again, and it doesn't reflect the actual majority will of the people. So with that, I actually would like to leave a bit of time for questions, but the latest update in terms of where ballot measure 2 is, I just wanted to kind of give people post-election day events. There was sort of the unprecedented move to do an audit by hand of every vote for ballot measure 2, which was unusual, but was spurred by some conspiracy theories led out of the fact that it trailed by 12% on election night, but the mail-in ballots and the early votes put it over the top by 1%. Some folks felt that wasn't a legitimate result, even though they liked some of the other results on the ballot. The good news there, the state did that hand count, which we participated in, we observed. It was a great process, and the new voting machines the state has have an even lower voting error rate than the last set of equipment. So what happened was, I think the tabulation was off by about 35 votes, which means, you know, the error rate was 1 in 10,000, which is just phenomenal. So the good news is our state machines work great. Ballot measure 2's win was confirmed, and we kind of move on with life. Other things that are going on is our ballot group is actually going to transform itself into an educational group. And we want to help take the next 2 years to educate Alaskans, do things we couldn't do during the campaign. Hopefully we will be able to travel around the state soon. Again, you know, vaccinations and all that, particularly to rural Alaska. We want to assist the Division of Elections because they've got to redesign their ballots. They've got to educate Alaska, produce new materials, and then translate those materials into the many languages we have here in Alaska. So we are going to be a nonprofit entity helping those efforts. The flip side of what we'll be doing is there has been a lawsuit filed challenging us in early December, and we've intervened in that case, and we hope that that case will be litigated kind of rather quickly. We don't see anything in that case that from our perspective is any real danger to the ballot measure, because we did draft the ballot measure around existing US Supreme Court and Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decisions that approved of ranked choice voting, approved of these kinds of open primaries. And I guess with that, I will turn it to Amy to take some questions.
What happened? Could you explain briefly exactly how that count works on the ranked voting? In other words, after the first round, and you have candidates A, B, C, and D, and A and B are the highest ranking candidates, but neither one gets a majority. What do you count on the second round?
Yeah, so a really, what I find a really good way of explaining this is sort of to visualize it, because you can actually do this by hand. It's not a computer algorithm or anything so exotic. So imagine a race for simplicity's sake where there's only 3 candidates and there's 11 voters total. And what you end up with in the first round is a stack of 4 votes for one candidate, a stack of 4 votes for another candidate, and a stack of 3 votes for the next candidate. What happens in that situation is the candidate with 3 votes is in last place, and you simply pick up that stack of 3 votes and you look and see what their second choice is and you put them in the stack. And if 2 of them go here, 1 of them goes there, that candidate wins 6-5. And it's really not any more complicated than that.
So in other words, the only people that get their second choices counted are the people whose first choice candidate did not win.
Correct. The majority of voters, and it's important to distinguish because some folks have said, oh, you've got certain voters who get to vote over and over and over again, and I'm over here and I only got to vote once. That's not necessarily true because every vote counts in every round of tabulation. It's just if your candidate happens to be in first, second place and not in last place, your first choice vote is counting in each of those rounds. And it's those other ones that have the opportunity to shift. Now, if they didn't choose a second choice, then they're out of the tabulation. But if they did, then that vote does transfer to their second choice. And also important to remember that if any candidate gets to 50% plus 1, in most of the cases, in most of the races in Alaska this year, and that might change with more candidates in the race, but in most of the races, someone got to 50% and the tabulation ends.
What happens in the situation where, for example, you're only counting the votes of those people whose choices did not come in first or second? What happens when you have one candidate with 48% and 2 candidates with 20%, and then the rest is spread out? But the second choice is, it could switch the majority. I mean, how does that work? Because then you've got almost 60% of the people getting their second choice counted, except for the people who voted for the first choice.
Well, again, the
I
people
don't
who vote for the
understand what
first,
happens when you game this out for all the permutations. Is it like the road to Abilene where everybody gets what they don't want?
What happens is the people who didn't vote first place can have their vote transferred to the second choice. But the people who voted for the first choice, their vote counts in every round of tabulation, if that makes sense. So what you do is you vote
not their second choice vote.
Right. Their second choice vote doesn't need to count because every voter can only vote once in the final result. So if you chose the person who's in first place, your vote's counting every round of tabulation. And what it does is it avoids the spoiler effect and potentially perverse outcomes. So an outcome could happen in a 3-person race where a person wins with 37% of the vote, but 63% of the voters would have preferred either of the other 2 choices. This prevents that scenario. And Senator Murkowski's, I hesitate to go back to it, but it's a very prominent example that folks are aware of is in her race, ultimately at the end, she ended up with 39%, Joe Miller with 35, Scott McAdams with approximately 25. Now, most people believe, and I don't know, you'd have to run this system to know, most people believed that a lot of people were choosing between Senator Murkowski and Scott McAdams. And that, if they had a 1-2 choice, it was those 2 choices. And it was a lot of people who would normally vote for the Democrat, considering whether to support Senator Murkowski to prevent the other candidate. Now, if you just change those results by a couple of percent, Joe Miller could have won with 37. You'd have Senator Murkowski over here with 35, and then you'd have Scott McAdams. And so you'd end up with a result where 63% of the state didn't want this guy to win, but in a plurality system, he wins by chance. And that's kind of fundamentally non-democratic because the majority is not speaking because of a quirk of how our system runs. And it's important to realize too.
How does that compare in perfection, in the ideal, with the system that goes on in Georgia just now, where you had a runoff?
So Georgia's system is really, really, really interesting because it's sort of a slow motion version of exactly what we're talking about here. What happens is, and it's a lot of what happens like in Anchorage's mayor race, we have the same system. So you have a race where everyone gets in, and then just the top two move on, and then people vote through those two. Essentially, ranked choice voting does a version of that process, but you only have to cast one ballot. So you save millions of dollars of, well, one, I have some friends in Georgia and they said, you've never seen anything like $500 million being spent in one state in 30 days. They've seen something no one else in the country's ever seen. So that's problem one. But problem two is millions of dollars spent to run another election when a ranked choice ballot would have done that process for them. They could have run the stages of the tabulation and had that result.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Rosemary, did you have a question?
Me? Yeah.
Scott, oh, sorry, go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Rosemary, I'll wait.
Yeah. So in our country, we've always had fairly strong political parties. Some of them are, in the annals of history now, but at certain points in our democratic process, they've existed. And those political parties used to choose their candidates at district or state conventions or something like that. Do you think the people who don't like this system would have the option of going back to a state convention to select the parties, or district conventions to select parties, and that's who would go on the ballot, rather than going through this kind of convoluted, I'm sorry, I think it's kind of a convoluted thing. And I think that the voters, unless you do some really extensive education, are going to be very confused. When voters are confused, they don't go. So I guess I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Yeah, so, to start off first, one of the problems we were getting at is, voter confusion is a real concern. But we have enormous voter confusion right now in Alaska, particularly in our primary process. So people go to the polls and they are offered a ballot. If you are an R, U, and N, you can take either ballot. But if you're an A, a D, an L, and there's an owl party, a moderate R, if you're any of these other things, you can only take this ballot. And so an awful lot of people go to the ballot right now and are confused, which ballot do I take? Because they might have in mind, there's a certain candidate I want to vote for in the primary, but I don't know which ballot they're on. So that's one of the things we were trying to get at is, let's give every Alaskan one ballot with every single candidate on it. And then they can do something they haven't been able to do since the 90s, which is, maybe I support a Republican for US Senate, but a Democrat for State House. They can do that now, which they cannot do in the past. So that's, to voter confusion, I think there are certain systems we think are intuitive, but don't appear to be. And we get that 10 and 12% turnout because of that confusion. And in states that have gone to an open primary system, we've seen turnout go up as much as 50% the very next election in the primary, which I think everyone believes is a good thing. Higher turnout, better results. To your kind of original question about conventions, it's important to talk about what this measure takes away from parties and what it doesn't. So what it does take away from parties is the role of gatekeeper. Right now, the two major political parties essentially own a slot on the ballot. So they can keep people from getting on, they can allow people on, they can endorse people, they can basically pretty strongly control that. As we saw in last year's primary elections, the party can essentially decide, even with long-term candidates that have been on there again and again, they can block them from the ballot in these low turnout elections. They have the power to go to convention at any time. They have the power to have official candidates at any time. But what they will no longer have the power to do is guarantee the person that gets on the ballot or block someone from the ballot. So if they say, in this race, this one Republican is our candidate, they can vote on that in convention, they can communicate that, they can officially endorse that person, but that person will nonetheless have to come in the top 4 or they don't make the ballot. And if, for example, the Republican Party says, there are 2 Republicans in this race, we like this one, we don't like this one because they had the gall to be in a bipartisan coalition, so we're against them. But if that person is in the top 4, they get to move on to the general election. The party can no longer be that barrier. So
But can the party skip the primary process and go straight to the general ballot?
no, it cannot.
Okay,
The parties are running for the people of Alaska, and the parties no longer kind of own that slot. Now, that's to say, if a candidate is viable, they better show up in the top 4 results. Otherwise, you know, I wouldn't think much of their chances in the general election anyway.
Scott, so just to be clear, this new process, which goes into effect in 2022, affects all legislative races and statewide races for statewide office. And then I have a second question after that, which is, please explain, why do 4 people move forward out of the primary instead of the top 2?
Yeah, so answering kind of both those questions. Could you rephrase the first question again? I just want to make sure I get it right.
What races does it not apply to? I assume all legislative races, all statewide races. What are exempt? I wasn't clear when you mentioned the federal level.
Yeah, so it's a little confusing there. So I think that's what you were getting at. So confusingly, the dark money provision applies only to state races. And that's because the federal government has preempted campaign finance for all federal races. We have the Federal Elections Commission, and so they run those disclosures. We run everything from governor on down. But in terms of running our elections, every state is actually, as we've seen rather interestingly play out over the last couple of months, or, you know, depends on your definition of interesting, but every state under the US Constitution is empowered to run their own elections their own way. And that's true for federal offices, state offices. So this will affect every office that the state runs the election for. So that's president, senator, US Congress, governor, US or state house, and state senate. It won't affect your local municipal races, but it basically runs everything else.
And why do 4 move out of a primary into the general? Wouldn't you want the top 2?
So top 2 was something, as we were drafting this, we looked at, because one of our goals was more functional government and less polarization. Whether that's a goal anyone shares or not, we sort of believed when public officials can work together, they work best. And we've seen a cycle in Alaska, at least, of we get these bipartisan coalitions, and then the parties come in and primary the participants, knock off enough of them, and then everyone goes back to their partisan corners again. And we may be in kind of a cycle of that, as well as we know some Republicans were targeted last year. We may still get bipartisan organizations, but that's the dynamic we are kind of seeking to break. And a top 2 system doesn't really cure the problem, because as I was discussing how, you know, 75 to 80% of our state legislative races are non-competitive, meaning it's a Democrat or a Republican seat, not a swing seat. What you might end up with, or would often end up with, is 2 Ds, 2 Rs. Now, if you're in a district that has 2 Ds show up, why do you show up on election day? No one is talking about your issues. No one's bringing your issues forward. And likewise with a Republican. With a top 3 or top 4 system, you're guaranteed, you know, both the diversity that maybe there's a libertarian, maybe there's a Green Party, but you're virtually guaranteed someone from each major party, meaning you've got a reason to show up. You kind of got your first love there on the ballot, because the last thing we want to do is diminish turnout or cause further polarization, because, you know, we have these seats where essentially the Democratic Party or the Republican Party owns it. With more diversity, with 3 or 4 on the ballot, an independent is viable. Or maybe you've got a candidate who's a one-issue candidate. Their one issue is climate change. They can't get elected, maybe, in this district, but they bring that issue of climate change and they've got 10 or 12 or 15% support. The other candidates have to take that issue into account and try to court the second choice votes of that voter. So more political diversity of political thought is seen as a positive. And we've seen that in areas that have done these systems is 60+% of the electorate is happy with the people they choose because they see something in them that made them make them a first choice or a second choice. So I hope that answers it. But what we have seen, unfortunately, with pure top 2 primaries is one party becoming predominant and the political discourse actually getting narrower.
Do you think this will drive up the expenditures in campaigns if you have 4 people moving to the primary? I'm just thinking out loud here. And wouldn't the person with the greatest amount of money potentially be able to penetrate the market better. Just curious if that was a discussion amongst your group in the long term.
There are a lot of factors. I mean, incumbency weighs heavy. A lot of factors weigh heavy, but what we wanted to cease to see, at least the people who supported this, was a public official who's beholden to his party, or maybe 6 or 8 party operatives in his or her district, and not to 50% plus one of their entire constituency. And so money is always going to play a role, and that's an unfortunate side effect of the Citizens United case, because in terms of candidates, we have very low contribution limits in Alaska. We should have relatively little campaign spending, but independent groups can spend whatever they can raise. And that's part of the dark money aspect, is we brought that in saying, this is a growing problem. Someone can come in and just buy, a race. Someone can come in with $1 million and say, I want this person to win the primary for governor, and $1 million will probably do it. Is that a good system or not? So the dark money says, we can't stop that money, but we're darn sure going to know your name if you do that.
Jill?
I have a question. What
Okay.
if, let's say in the primary, you have 8 candidates on the ballot?
Then everyone will choose their favorite, and the top 4 vote getters move on.
Can I ask a question?
Yes,
Sure.
go ahead.
Yeah, it's my understanding there's a petition either going around already or being created to remove the ranked choice voting. Can you address that, please? Thank you.
If there's a petition, I'm unaware of it, but there is a lawsuit challenging the measure. A petition, I'm not sure what the petition is that you refer to, but an important thing to remember about ballot measures in Alaska is they're constitutionally protected. So essentially, absent a court challenge that could find that this was unconstitutional, this system is guaranteed to stay into effect for 2 years. The legislature can't repeal it within 2 years, even if they want to. So I'm not sure what the petition is, but I'm not sure that it could have any legal effect on implementation. Anything short of a court saying this is unconstitutional, you can't do it, this will be the system in either 2022 or if we happen to have a special election before then.
Jill Matheson, you had a question?
I just had a question. So I know that you talked about this before we voted on it, but how many states use this sort of ranked choice voting, and for how long have they been doing it? And do you have like success rates or anything like that that you could discuss?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like any question you ask an attorney, it's a little bit of a complicated answer. But in terms of statewide, only one other state does it statewide. That's Maine. Other states are looking at it, but what a lot of states have done, and I can't remember if we're about 16 or 18 states, but that what they have done is said local governments can do this if they wish. So they've passed it at the state level, kind of down to their local communities. And I think New York City kind of famously has just recently passed it. So I think between state and local governments, there's somewhere between 35 and 50 million Americans now that live in a jurisdiction where there's ranked choice voting at some level of their government. You've seen it really throughout the Southwest and some of the West, an awful lot of local governments, by which I mean municipalities, counties, cities are doing it. And the nice thing we are seeing there is when you study the numbers, the satisfaction rates are very high. So people tend to not get what we get oftentimes in kind of what we call first past the post or plurality voting, which is 60% or 55% are just displeased with the outcome. Another interesting metric is they passed it in Maine through ballot measure, as we did here. Their state legislature has attempted, I don't know if it's 2 or 3 times now to repeal it. And what they've done there is basically a people's veto, like a referendum saying, no, you can't take it away. So once the people have gotten it there in Maine, it's become very, very, very popular and they want to keep it.
Who else? Rosemary?
Yeah, so I have a dark money question. is it just on ballot measure issues where the top contributors have to be identified in the advertising? And I can't remember if some of the PACs for candidates have to do that as well.
Yeah, both.
Currently.
Yeah, both ballot measure groups and what they call super PACs, or sometimes they're called independent expenditure groups, or IEs. They have to disclose their donors. The only people who don't have to disclose their donors. Yeah, in the ads, the people who don't have to disclose their donors are the candidates, because what we know is they can only take 500 per person. So the candidate can say, I'm the candidate, I approve this message.
Right.
But IEs and ballot groups have to disclose those top donors. And then, of course, over on APOC's website, they have to disclose all their donors.
Right. And
the problem,
so
I guess, that dark money is.
What's the difference with your dark money part of this initiative then? If you already have to disclose the top voters in advertising.
So the problem that the dark money component gets at is, if I, Scott Kendall, if I was a millionaire, and I wish, and I literally wanted to donate $5 million in the governor's race for 2022, I'll go write a check for $5 million to the American Chamber of Commerce, or frankly, like an irrelevant entity, the Texas Chamber of Commerce. They can literally turn around and write a check for $5 million back to a group here in Alaska. And that group in Alaska will only report the Texas group. They won't report me. There's no requirement or incentive in law to go anywhere past whoever just wrote you the proximate check. And we know from studying these dark money trails around the country that that's not how it works. That it is a handful of wealthy individuals, wealthy corporations. And all we're saying is, spend the money. We can't stop you, but we need to know who you are, because, logic would say, okay, if I'm a governor, if I'm a lieutenant governor, and someone just spent $5 million to get me elected, I think that's something the public would want to know. That may be innocuous. That may never affect my thought process, but I think the public thinks that it might.
Right. So this is going to affect the people like Facebook and Twitter and all those folks that have suddenly said we're no longer going to participate.
It won't affect them unless they're running around donating money. When they donate money, we will know.
We'll know. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Got time for one more question. Anybody?
There's a question on chat that's been there a while, Doug. Just a quickie. Does Alaska use Dominion voting systems?
We actually do, and I have actually some opinions about that. Some of you may or may not know, I was previously Governor Walker's chief of staff. And during that time, we actually did some of the contracting to replace our voting system, which, they were from the 80s and 90s, and the machines were literally falling apart. At one point, 35 to 40% of the machines would just fail on election night because they were that old. So we replaced them. I think those were Diebold, and we replaced them with Dominion voting systems. And those systems are literally just a scanner that takes ballots in and tabulates them. They don't do anything else. They can't be hacked in the conventional sense. They're not hooked up to the internet. They just aren't. We have what's called the sneaker net. You run the ballots through, and you put a card in, and you walk that card over to another computer. None of the system is hooked up to the internet. So in terms of, there's some conspiracy theories, so to speak, about Dominion. But I'll say, the proof's in the pudding. They audited the ballot measure 2 election. Again, the error rate was a factor of 1 in 10,000. That's just an incredibly accurate rate. That's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent. So yes, those are the machines that have been subject to some debate. I think Dominion voting systems currently, against some attorneys who have made some provably false claims about them, I think they have like a $1 billion defamation claim going right now. But yes, long answer to a short question. Alaska's new machines are Dominion voting machines.
All right, Scott. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for the work you've done for the state.